Like this because we're getting into some things that are a little bit maybe funner. The overall topic is going to be the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and then we're going to talk about the election of 1952. You'll notice in here we've got some topics: 1953 at a glance, 1957 at a glance, 1958 at a glance. Those are kind of fun because we tell you something off the wall that happened in each month of those years. So it becomes a lot of information, but we'll get through it, and I think you'll enjoy it. We're getting close to the 1960s, and we're making good pace here. So, okay, the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. We're going to talk about the election of 1952. Election of 1952. Now, generally in a presidential election, when the incumbent president either chooses not to run or would be limited, not yet, but will be limited by the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, it makes the election wide open. All of a sudden you've got candidates coming from both, lots of them emerge. And that happened in the election of 2017 when Barack Obama was limited by the 22nd Amendment, and all of a sudden you got all kinds of Republicans that want to be in it and all kinds of Democrats, and it just leaves it wide open to both parties. Well, the Republican Party really was split going into the election of 1952. They had two separate wings. They had the conservative wing of the Republican Party, and they had the liberal wing of the Republican Party. And each side favored a different candidate for president. And normally, this would cause you problems unless the parties would then unite prior to the election. But normally, if you have a split party, it can hurt that party. Well, the conservative wing of the Republican Party really favored Mr. Republican, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, for the nomination, who we've already talked about. So conservative Republicans were favoring Mr. Republican, that would be Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, for the nomination. The liberal wing was favoring General Dwight Eisenhower for nomination. So you had a split in the Republican Party right away, where the conservative wing wanted Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, and the liberal wing wanted General Dwight Eisenhower. Well, after what they considered a pretty spirited Republican convention, and it becomes more spirited when you have lots of possible candidates, Eisenhower is going to be nominated for the presidency on the first ballot. Now, have I talked to you about how that works? Because that's going to become prevalent from this point on. What happens is you get the Republicans or Democrats together in a national convention, and they campaign and they campaign and they campaign for a few days, and then they go to vote. And the first ballot starts with the first state in the alphabet, okay? And they would say, and each state sends delegates, a certain number of delegates, depending on how many delegate votes they get. What's the delegate votes based on? What? Population. So, for example, you have so many delegate votes depending on how much your population is. So they would start out the convention like, the great state of Alabama, home of the national champion football, Alabama Crimson Tide, gives their 27 delegate votes to the next president of the United States, Casey Wassup. Then those delegate votes go on her side. And then whoever gains the proper number of delegate votes wins the nomination. Now, if they went all the way A through Z through the alphabet with states, and no candidate received that number of votes that you needed to be nominated, then they would have a second ballot, and everything that happened the first ballot didn't count. Okay? Very seldom does a nomination go to a second ballot, but it can. In this particular case, Eisenhower was nominated for the presidency on the first ballot. So when they went through the state roll call and gave out delegates, he got enough delegates from different states to gain the number he needed for nomination. Well, once he was nominated, he chose California Senator Richard M. Nixon as his vice presidential running mate. And we will talk a lot about Richard Nixon during the remainder of this year in different arenas. So Eisenhower then chose California Senator Richard M. Nixon as his running mate. So it will be General Dwight D. Eisenhower for president and California Senator Richard M. Nixon for vice president on the Republican ticket in '52. The Democrats also had a wide open convention and much debate, and when that dust settled, the Democratic Party settled on Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois for the presidency and Senator John Sparkman of Alabama as his running mate. So after much debate at the Democratic National Convention, the Democratic Party settled on Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois for the presidency and Senator John Sparkman of Alabama as his running mate. Adlai Stevenson was a tremendous politician, maybe one of the best politicians this country's ever had. He never got lucky enough ever to win a presidential nomination or election process. Okay, and never was able to be elected president. But he was a great politician, and you'll hear a lot more about him as we talk later into the 60s. Well, the Republican Party decided to campaign on the 5 following issues. Now, kiddos, is it always easier for the party that didn't hold the White House to campaign in an election? Because what do? They spend all their time doing what? Criticizing what the other party did. So actually it's much easier for the party that was not controlling the presidency to campaign. You can be more critical. Here are the 5 things that the Republican Party campaigned on in the election of 1952. First of all, they promised to clean up the political corruption within the Democratic Party during the Truman years. They promised to clean up the political corruption within the Democratic Party during the Truman years. Were there any political corruptions that we really talked about during his administration? No, so I'm not sure there was any political corruption during that time, but they campaigned they would clean up that political corruption. Second thing the Republican Party campaigned on in 1952 is they were going to clean up the mess in Washington from the Truman administration. They were going to clean up the mess in Washington from the Truman administration. That's pretty typical of a campaign promise of a party that wasn't in control of the White House. They're clean up the mess in Washington. Okay. Third thing that the Republican Party campaigned on in the election of 1952 is they charged that the Democratic Party had enlarged the power of the federal government over the power of state government. Okay? They charged or accused the Democratic Party of enlarging the powers of the federal government over the powers of the state government. Don't all of us as states, doesn't Wyoming like to control most of their destiny? For example, the marijuana situation. So, Colorado was passed to legalize marijuana. Wyoming has not. That means that state governments still have a lot of power. And most politicians like to see the power stay in the state government and not give the federal government too much. So the example, if the federal government said that every state in the union had to legalize marijuana, that would be a lot of power that the federal government had. And so what the Republicans did is they accused the Truman administration of enlarging or making the power bigger in the federal government and taking power away from the state governments, which wouldn't be popular. Okay, that's what they did. Okay? What else do you think? What's the fourth thing they campaigned on? Think about what we talked about in history. What could they criticize the Democrats about that's going on right now that hasn't ended? The Korean War. So the fourth thing that the Republicans campaigned on in the election of 1952 was they accused the Truman administration of bungling up or screwing up the Korean War. Because it's still going, remember? There's no solution at this point. So they accused the Truman administration of bungling up the Korean War. So what would be their natural fifth thing they would campaign on? If we're elected, we'll do everything in our power to end the Korean War. Okay? So the fourth thing they campaigned on was they accused the Truman administration of bungling up or screwing up the war. And the fifth thing is that if you elect us, we'll do everything in our power to end the Korean War. Well, the Democrats campaigned on 2 issues, but they're kind of weak because you're always the one getting the criticism. So they campaigned on the fact that, hey, the Fair Deal was a great administration and our foreign policies were great and we really made some progress. So they campaigned, number 1, on the success of the Fair Deal and their success in dealing with foreign countries. Okay, so those are the 2 things that they campaigned on. They defended the Fair Deal, and they said that their foreign policies during the Truman administration helped around the world. Now, it's kind of interesting because the other party's going to, say, hey, You elect us, we'll have peace and we'll have prosperity and we'll have progress. You know, it's pretty easy to promise those things and then see if you get them done. So the Democrats also kind of mentioned, you know, this peace and prosperity and progress that these Republicans are promising you if they get elected, not going to be as easy as they're portraying. So that's kind of what they went on. Well, on November 4th of 1952, voters went to the polls in record numbers. More people voted in this election than any other election up to that point in American history. A record number of voter turnout in the election of 1952, and they went to the polls on November 4th, 1952. Now, what's a good popular vote victory, Olivia? If you win in the popular vote, by what percent is a good percent? Anybody? Oh no, popular vote. There's the 100% of the popular vote. What's a good victory in popular vote? 55 to 45 is a pretty good butt kicking, really. You know what I mean? Well, Eisenhower actually won the popular vote 57%. That's a big win in the popular vote, 57%. You know, 52 to 48 in that area, but he had 57%. Anytime you get over 55% of the popular vote, that's a pretty big victory. But we all know that popular vote and $1 or whatever might buy you a pop or a drink in the pop machine. It all comes down to what? The Electoral College. Well, Eisenhower defeated Adlai Stevenson in the Electoral College 442 to 89. It was a massive butt kick. 442 to 89. Now, what else would Eisenhower like as far as a victory, not only for himself, but what other victory would he like in 1952? Republican-controlled Congress, and he got that. He got a Republican-controlled Congress. So the Republican Party also managed to win control of Congress. That is a very big victory. And as a result of the election of 1952, Dwight David Eisenhower became the nation's 34th President of the United States. Okay? Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is a ceasefire in Korea. Ceasefire in Korea. Because remember, the Korean War is still going on. Now, we mentioned that one of the campaign promises on the part of the Republican Party during the 1952 election was to end the Korean War, right? Now, this is how smart Eisenhower was. You see if you can figure this out. On December 17th of 1952, Eisenhower made a 3-day visit to Korea. On December 17th, 1952, he made a 3-day visit to Korea. Why is that a little unusual? December 17th, 1952. It is. It's going on, but think of the date, December. He hadn't been inaugurated. He wasn't even the president yet. He was the president-elect. So he took time, which was very wise, prior to being inaugurated, to go over and start the process with Korea. He didn't want to wait till it was inaugurated. So on December 17, 1952, prior to his inauguration, President-elect Eisenhower made a 3-day visit to Korea. And he began talks with both political and military leaders from both North Korea and South Korea. Okay, so the President-elect began talks with political and military leaders from both North Korea and South Korea. Anybody know where they met? Somebody in here better. Where'd they meet? Panmunjom. They met at Panmunjom, and that was one of the names on the list of We Didn't Start the Fire. So the President-elect began talks with political and military leaders from both North Korea and South Korea at a location called Panmunjom. That's on your ID sheet. Who was the South Korean president at the time? Anybody know? Somebody in here better know. Who was the South Korean president at this time? Well, maybe we haven't got there yet. Syngman Rhee. Anybody have that one? I think that's later because the significance of his is different. So Eisenhower met with South Korean President Syngman Rhee, and they agreed on a clear and definite solution to the war. Eisenhower met with South Korean President Syngman Rhee, and they agreed to a clear and definite solution to the war. Who else went with Eisenhower? Anybody want to guess who went to negotiate with Eisenhower? You might be surprised. No? Who? General MacArthur. He took General Douglas MacArthur with him, who Truman had fired because he felt that MacArthur would have good negotiating skills. So Eisenhower, General MacArthur, and South Korean President Syngman Rhee agreed on a clear and definite solution to the war. Well, even though it took 7 months to get this done, and on July 27th of 1953, July 27th of 1953, North Korea and the United Nations, remember it was fought under UN command, signed an armistice agreement. In other words, they signed a treaty to disarm. On July 27th, 1953, North Korea and the United States signed an agreement to disarm. Now, what happened to Korea during that time? What was the agreement? It recognized Korea into two different countries, right? North Korea, which was communist, and they called it the Republic of South Korea, which was non-communist. So really, we were back to where we started when you think about it. So this agreement recognized the division of Korea into two different countries, North Korea, which would be allowed to be ruled by a communist leader, and the Republic of South Korea, which would be ruled by non-communist leader. Now, we're right back to where we are, and the final point of this agreement was the United States assured the Republic of South Korea that they would defend their country against what? Any communist aggression, just like we had started. So when you think about it, they fought that war for quite a period of time, resulting in some casualties I'll tell you about in a minute. And where were they on July 27, 1953? Right back where they started, except for North Korea hadn't got the idea to take South Korea. But they were right back to where they started. Okay? Now, the Korean War had lasted around just approximately 3 years, and I'll tell you the cost of the war. 33,629 Americans were killed in action. 33,629 American soldiers were killed in action. Who else fought in this besides American soldiers on our side? South Koreans and other UN countries. I don't have an exact number, but when you add up the soldiers that fought from South Korea and other United Nations, 546,000 killed in action. Over 500,000 killed in action. So if you include the Americans in that side, you're looking at almost 600,000. 546,000 soldiers from the United Nations and South Korea, and 33,629 American soldiers. So almost 600,000 of the good guys, so to speak, lost their lives. Anybody want to guess how many North Korean soldiers were killed? 1.5 million. 1.5 million North Korean soldiers were killed in the Korean War. 1.5 million. You know who else out-deathed, so to speak? Out-deathed the good guy side, the United Nations side? Who else? No? Who else? 1 million people lost their life. What type of people lost their life? South Korean civilians. 1 million across. So in the Korean War, 33,629 American soldiers, 546,000 soldiers from the United Nations, including South Korea, were killed in the action. 1.5 North Korean soldiers were killed, and approximately 1 million South Korean civilians. That's a lot of people killed in 3 years. Now, this is my own personal political opinion, but did we have protests in the Korean War? Did we have a bunch of people mad about that? We really did not. But when the same thing happens where? Vietnam. Basically the same concept happens in Vietnam. We start thinking, did we learn anything from Korea? And when these American body bags start coming home, people start protesting. And we'll get into that whole thing later. Okay, our next subtopic then will be a profile on Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'll tell you a little bit about the man. Profile on Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight David Eisenhower was born on October 14th, 1890 in Denison, Texas. That would be D-E-N-I-S-O-N. Dwight David Eisenhower was born on October 14th, 1890 in Denison, Texas. D-E-N-I-S-O-N. His father's name was David. His mother's name was Ida, I-D-A, and they were a very deeply religious couple. Dwight's parents were David and Ida, both very, very deeply religious. David Eisenhower and his wife Ida had 6 children, all boys. 6 children, all boys. And Dwight was right in the middle. He had 2 older brothers and 3 younger brothers. So the Eisenhower family had 6 children, all boys. Dwight was in the middle of the family. He had 2 older brothers and 3 younger brothers. When Dwight was 2 years old, his family moved from Denison, Texas to Abilene, Kansas, where his father took a job in a creamery. When Dwight was 2 years old, the family moved to Abilene, Kansas, A-B-I-L-E-N-E, A-B-I-L-E-N-E, where his father took a job in a creamery. Now in those days, boys didn't sit home and play video games or go out for football or